Imagine being worshipped as a living god. Imagine ruling an empire richer than all of Spain. And now imagine losing everything. Your throne, your people, your own life in less than 2 years without your enemy ever winning a single real battle. This is not fiction. This is the true story of a king who mistook his own executioner for a god coming home. Montezuma II ruled an empire so vast that runners sprinted in relay teams across mountains and jungles just to bring him fresh fish from the ocean, timed perfectly so it reached his table before it could spoil. From 1502 onward, he commanded 5 to 6 million people across hundreds of subject cities, not thousands, millions. His capital was larger than any city in Europe, bigger than Paris, bigger than London. His army had never truly lost a war. Officials collected tribute twice a year. Gold, cacao, cotton, jade, even human beings offered in his name. He had everything a man could want: absolute power, unimaginable wealth, worship so complete that ordinary people were forbidden to look into his eyes. And yet this same man, the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere, was about to make one mistake so catastrophic it would erase 2 centuries of his ancestors' work. The tragic part, he wouldn't understand what he'd done until the chains were already locked around his own wrists. Now picture his city, Tenochtitlan. Not just a capital, but a floating miracle that shouldn't have been possible with the technology of its time. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by causeways wide enough for 10 men, with removable bridges that could seal the city off in
the
danger.
Aztec Chinampas,
Canals
one of
replaced
history's
streets.
greatest
Floating
agricultural
gardens called
achievements,
Chinampas
capable
fed a
of
quarter
feeding
of a million people daily,
every
producing
day.
more food per acre than almost anywhere on Earth. The Great Temple rose 60 meters into the sky, twin pyramids gleaming with fresh blood and paint. When Spanish soldiers, men hardened by war across Europe and the Caribbean, finally saw this city, they wept. They rubbed their eyes, certain they were hallucinating. Bernal Diaz del Castillo later wrote it felt like a dream too perfect to be real. This was the throne Montezuma was born and trained to rule. And this glittering, impossible empire is exactly what he was about to lose forever. But understand, this man was no accidental king. Montezuma trained since childhood in the Calmecac, the strict priestly schools for nobility, studying astronomy, ritual, warfare, and law. He commanded armies in battle years before taking the throne, earning a name as disciplined and ruthless. As emperor, he crushed rebellions without hesitation and pushed the empire's borders further than any ruler before him. At home, he doubled tribute demands, replaced local officials with loyalists, and distanced himself from commoners in ways no emperor had before, quietly breeding resentment in conquered cities that would matter enormously later. And around him always stood astrologers and priests, reading omens in fire, in birds, in the stars. In the years before 1519, they returned again and again with the same warning: something is coming. Montezuma believed them completely. According to accounts written decades after the conquest, comets burned across the sky for months, trailing fire so bright that people gathered in terrified silence. Temples caught fire with no explanation, and no water could put out the flames. Lake Texcoco rose and boiled without a drop of rain, flooding homes overnight. In the darkest hours, people swore they heard a woman's voice, Cihuacoatl, the snake woman, wailing through the streets, crying that ruin was coming for her children. Historians still debate how much of this was real, exaggerated, or invented afterward by survivors trying to explain a disaster too vast to otherwise understand. But here is what matters. Montezuma believed every omen without question, and that belief quietly set the trap for everything still to come. In early 1519, messengers arrived from the Gulf Coast, breathless and shaken. They described floating temples on the water, taller than anything ever seen, white cloth stretched like wings. They described pale, bearded men wrapped in shining metal, riding 4-legged creatures the empire had no word for. They described weapons that roared like thunder and killed from a distance no arrow could reach. Montezuma's priests, working within the only framework their world allowed, reached one devastating conclusion: this had to be Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, returning as prophecy foretold. Hernán Cortés hadn't even reached the mainland yet, and already the most powerful man in the Americas was asking himself a question with no good answer. What do you do when a god comes home to collect? So instead of ordering his hundreds of thousands of warriors to crush these strangers on the beach, something he could likely have done in a single afternoon, Montezuma chose gold instead, gift after gift, carried by exhausted messengers between the coast and the capital. capital. Golden masks, feathered headdresses of rare Quetzal plumes, solid gold discs so heavy it took 2 men to carry one, all meant to honor a returning god, or perhaps to convince him to simply turn back to sea. The plan backfired completely. The gold didn't satisfy Cortez. It proved an empire's worth of wealth was waiting just beyond the horizon. Every gift was read not as reverence, but as fear and weakness, and every polite delay bought Cortez something far more valuable than gold: time to march inland, and time to gather allies among the Tlaxcalans, who were finally hungry for revenge after decades of Aztec domination. By November 1519, Montezuma walked out personally to greet Cortez with flowers in his own hands, welcoming him into the heart of his capital. Within days, that same guest had taken the God King hostage inside his own palace, ruling the empire through a captive emperor, while Spanish soldiers melted centuries of sacred Aztec goldwork into anonymous bars of bullion. Tensions exploded into violence after a massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious festival. When Montezuma was finally brought onto a balcony to calm the furious crowd below, something in his own people had already broken beyond repair. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, but many say it was his own people, the same people who once knelt before him as a god, who hurled the stones that killed him. He died days later, a prisoner inside his own home, abandoned by the empire that once worshipped him. Within a year of Montezuma's death, smallpox, a disease no Aztec body had ever faced, swept through the capital, killing millions in months. It claimed even the next emperor, Cuitlahuac, dead within 80 days of taking the crown. An empire that stood for nearly 2 centuries, that raised pyramids to rival Egypt, that built a capital more advanced than most of Europe, collapsed entirely in under 24 months. Montezuma's true failure was never cowardice and never simple weakness. It was believing his own empire's prophecy so completely that he could not see the ordinary mortal men standing directly in front of him until it was too late to act. And perhaps that is the real lesson buried in the ashes of Tenochtitlan. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the invader at your gate. It's the story you already decided was true, long before he ever arrived. Somewhere beneath modern Mexico City, under the concrete and the traffic and the noise of a world that has moved on, the stones of Tenochtitlan still lie buried. A city that once floated on water, now sleeping under the weight of everything that replaced it. And maybe that's the part that should actually keep you up at night. Not that an empire fell, empires always fall, but that the man who ruled it never saw the ending coming, even as it walked toward him, wearing a smile and carrying flowers of his own offering. He wasn't blind, he wasn't foolish, he was simply certain of a story his ancestors had told him since before he could remember, certain that the universe owed him one specific ending, and that certainty, the very thing that once made him a god among men, was the same thing that made him incapable of seeing the ordinary men standing right in front of him. So ask yourself quietly before this video ends, what story have you already decided is true that you stopped questioning? Because somewhere, right now, your own Cortez may already be walking up the coast.